I did not know what my politics was even in my own 20s. This is like slave patrol shit that we're talking about. What we have seen traditionally with Asian men is that in the respective homelands, it was always strictly patriarchal. I was at the Cartagena airport, it was packed. I looked at my Facebook and I realized that was the last time I talked to my brother, and I just started sobbing. They always say that when you get older, you become more conservative. I feel like it's been the opposite. I feel like I have gone what people would call radical. What the Republicans have done a really good job of is weaponizing trauma. They know how to work with immigrant fears and trauma. I dreaded having to come up to people or asking, well, what do you do? And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm a podcaster, and I have to explain myself. Right-wing male podcasters use trauma and confusion as a weapon. There's this attitude within our community among folks of that I got mine and just shut the door behind everyone else, even their own community members.
Welcome, friends, family, and fighters of all ages. This is round 4 of Seasoned Fighters, a show where we step into the ring with champions of social change so we can learn the art of fighting back. And in the blue corner, we have a queer Viet Khmer American from the Chicagoland area with a master's in nonprofit management at DePaul University. He's the creator and host of his award-winning podcast, the Bánh Mì Chronicles, and the recipient of the annual Communicator Awards 2024. He also formerly served as a board member with the National Cambodian Heritage Museum in Chicago and is now serving as a board member with the Vietnamese Association of Illinois. Please welcome our next fighter, Randy Kim. Randy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Rainier, for having me on. I've always admired your work over the years, and it feels so surreal to finally be having this conversation after all these years.
Yeah, it's like this is a conversation that should have happened years ago, but I feel like it happening now is perfect. And I'm glad to have you here today. So Randy, one of the things that we have in common is the fact that we both started podcast in 2019 during this COVID era. But while I only did 65 episodes and 4 seasons, which I'm proud of, you produced an incredible 154 episodes over 9 seasons.
Really? Is that how many? I didn't even realize it was that many. That is wild. It is
wild.
And I had taken 2 years off, until last August, and I didn't think I'd be back. But then when I came back, I was thinking, okay, I'm just going to do 10 episodes to last through the year. Well, I ended up doing 30 because of the ICE raids in Chicago at the time. So I felt like I was trying to be in emergency mode, trying to talk to community leaders and members about what's happening in the community. So I felt like this need to just continue. And I didn't realize I was putting out this many episodes. It's wild.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you're on this 4-year run. 2023 happened. So why again? What was the start of that 2-year break?
Yeah, I think the last year in 2023, I was starting to feel creatively bored. I was feeling like I had already accomplished everything I needed to do in podcasting. I had interviewed so many different guests, prolific, non-prolific, and I've gotten so much good stories, and I felt like this was starting to feel like a rinse and repeat. I was taking some time out for a few months, and then when I got back to it for 2023 for the final season, I was like, yeah, something's not clicking. I feel anxious to just walk away from it in a good note. And I think other people of my peers were also kind of leaving the podcasting scene. And then I kind of wonder, is this the time for me to step away, maybe take on a different project? And I was thinking about, doing a Substack called the Banh Mi Bites, which is kind of like a spin-off of sorts, and focusing more on the BIPOC authors, creatives, and other folks, but in more of a written format, more in a musing type format, if you would say. And I thought that was going to be the level that I was going to go on. And I think in 2024, it was getting off to a good start with it. I wasn't missing the podcast at all. I was happy to be relieved from it. And and I think around that time it was also the election too. It was definitely around the election time, and then you see people like the Joe Rogans of the world and the Manosphere podcasting like really emerge in a very toxic way. At least that's how I felt, and it became very challenging to be associated in that landscape of these folks that are constantly creating misinformation, platforming very dangerous people on their show, and and seeing how it has now become this echo chamber. I was like, I don't know if this is a good impact for me. So I wanted to shift into a different direction. I also didn't want to be defined by just being a podcaster. I think that was another part. But then when I was doing the Banh Mi Bites, I think it was getting off to a good start. I was starting to like gain some traction, but something was really missing. It was not the same feeling like I had when I started my podcast, definitely for the first 2 years, where there's so much excitement, so much anticipation. I think with Substack, it was like something's not clicking in. It's not pulling for me. And then that summer in 2024, I was dealing with mental health issues that, really plagued me a great deal. I had found out about my brother's kidney failure diagnosis, and I think that just started to pile on this heavy weight of sadness I was carrying with me, and not just the sadness, but the anxiety, the fears, and I was just not myself, if to say the very least. And I started to stay away from my own Substack, and I just didn't feel like I could create. And then, long story short, I was hospitalized in August, and I think that kind of made me realize how much I needed to pause. But I had to like reflect about where my mental health was going and what I needed to do to recalibrate. And yeah, I think I was starting to get back onto Substack. And I went on this Vietnam and Cambodia trip at the end of that year. I think in a way that helped to rebolster my creativity. It really helped to feel more grounded again. And then when I got back home, my brother passes away in January of last year. And then it just felt like a continuation. And what the ideas that I had for my Substack then just got put to a halt. I was going to do this long recap about my Vietnam and Cambodia trip, and never been able to pull that off. I think the Cambodia recap ended up, I wrote about it like maybe several months later. The Vietnam trip, I still haven't done that. So all the ideas that I had to put them to the side. And then long story short, like during this past spring, I was hosting a live event for VAI, the Vietnamese Association of Illinois, and the author Nguyen Phan Quai Mai, who wrote Dust Child and The Mountains Sing, one of my favorite guests, one of the most down-to-earth people. I saw her talk before our live event, and I was in the audience, and then she just started saying how people should listen to my podcast, and we need to bring the podcast back. And I was very embarrassed by that, because I was like, I had felt so far removed by that point, and I was like, I don't know if this is something that's in the cards for me. And I was ready to leave and walk away from my job. So I think that I was going through this period where I needed to completely recalibrate and didn't know what that was going to look like. And when I did the live event, she was telling the audience that you need to come back to the podcast. So we need your voice in this. And I kind of told the audience, I was like, yeah, okay, I guess. I wasn't sure. And then when she planted that seed in my head after I had left my job, like at the end of May, I was starting to think, okay, well, it's a possibility. I could leave the store open, and then like around July, after I had gone back from Oregon to scatter my brother's ashes, then all of a sudden this creative burst of energy just came over me, and I felt the sense of urgency. It's like, yeah, we really need to do this. Or at least for me, I need to do this. I need to feel like I am doing something productive that allows me to be in community with folks, but also what's been going on with the Trump administration, I felt that it's important to intercept harmful narratives that have been happening quite a bit, especially in the podcasting sphere. And so I felt this small but important responsibility to intercept those harmful narratives and create important narratives that our communities need to hear, and that the stories that have not been reaching different media outlets, it has to come from a different platforms, and I felt responsible for part of that. And so, yeah, I got on the podcast, and next thing you know, I started doing some solo episodes, and I was thinking maybe I should just do 10 episodes, and let alone I didn't realize I was doing 30 episodes like in a 2 month span, which is
Wow.
unreal. Yeah,
Wow.
it was unreal. I mean, I was like in constant motion. Like everything that was going on with ICE raids in Chicago was absolutely infuriating. I had friends that were protesting in Broadview. I had, friends like living in the communities, telling us stories about what they were witnessing. And I felt like, what can I do in this moment? And what the media was not reporting, they weren't reporting what was happening, and like what the ICE agents were doing when they were like tear gassing supermarkets and schools. And it became this chaotic period. And this is what we're seeing in Minneapolis, and even worse. I felt that we need to get these stories out, but to report what's happening and get the news out to other cities so that they can be more prepared of what's going on. But I also wanted to highlight, and this is something that I feel very strongly with, is operating from a place of abundance, like an asset-based narrative where I want to share stories of what communities are doing to counter against ICE and the federal agents and police and and harmful characters or people that are very much involved in the what the Trump administration is doing. And so it was so essential to bring these stories of people fighting back and what they're doing to protect their communities, because it's easy to fall into despair and to hopelessness. And I knew that getting back on the podcast meant that I needed to do something that is going to at least make me be able to sleep several hours at night, because if I wasn't doing it, then, and I'm watching my city crumble apart because of what's going on, like I don't know what that would have done to my own mental health. So I felt like that doing the podcast in a way was a level of self-care. Weird enough to say that, because I was going nonstop, and then once around December hit, then I was able to finally step away from it for a little bit. So it's a good period of time right now where I'm like slowing down significantly, because I felt like, wow, this was a lot, and I didn't realize the effects of it until after ICE finally left. Most of ICE finally left Chicago at the end of I believe like around Thanksgiving, I believe, maybe a little bit before that. So around that time.
Wow. I mean, it's so interesting how your story as a creative, as an activist, it's like the same thing that will break down your mental health and make you feel like you're grinding and grinding and grinding can also be the thing that will wake you up from the dead of night and make you just so energized to do the work. And that is just I feel like that's such a beautiful story about what it means to be a creative and to be an activist. You know, to tell these stories, to create this space for other people to tell their stories. And I'm especially fascinated with people who've been doing this for a very long time. We had mentioned earlier that you have an extensive background in nonprofit management and activism, and it's always amazing to watch activists change over time. Some people over time they become more radical. Some people become more vocal, or they become more introverted. When you compare yourself in your earlier years, your earlier activist years versus today, what do you see that's changed? What beliefs, what practices have you learned? Have you had to unlearn?
Yeah, I think when I came back from Korea after like 3 years of living there, teaching abroad, I think it was like 2012, and I got a job as an immigrant rights organizer for a Korean American organization as a non-Korean person. But I thought about that period of time because I was just trying to look for work, and I knew that I wanted to go into nonprofit because I felt like that this was where I was gravitating towards. And so when I got brought on, I did not have any deeper connections uh, to the Korean community in Chicago, let alone what I would later realize is like the immigrant communities. I did not have the close ties because prior to living in Korea for those 3 years, I was a college student. I was very much entrenched into the suburbs. So I did not have a lot of deeper connections. And I felt like I had to start all over again from a place of zero. And the first 2 weeks of that job, the first thing that came out was DACA. When President Obama had issued DACA for undocumented students that were brought into the U.S. From at a very, very young age to 15 years old, I believe. And I think that was when I knew that this would change the trajectory of what I was doing, how important that work was going to be, because there were many students, many young people applying for DACA, and I had to learn how to handle the applications, and I was terrified. I was like, I don't want to be the reason why they can't get DACA. So, I had panic attacks about it, for days. But I saw how important it was, and to see a kid with their mom finally being able to have some hope that they can progress in their academic and professional career, but also ultimately with their personal lives, and not feel like they have to be in constant hiding and being hidden and tucked away. So I seeing that moment was very pivotal for me, and I did not know what my politics was even in my own 20s. Like I coming from Chicagoland area, President Obama was running for president, and so that was a huge deal. And so I think that's kind of where I started to become more liberal at that time. Growing up in DuPage County, which is a predominantly white religious demographic, it was very Republican. It was a very strong Republican stranglehold. So even some of the ideas that I used to believe in, or at least I was trying to make myself believe, no longer felt in alignment. So I'd say it really didn't start happening until I was about almost 30 years old, because I started making friends from different community groups. And some of them were several years younger than me. And so I was starting to get an idea of what the immigration movement really looked like. Why are there undocumented folks? What's the myth behind it that we have to break? So I think that's, for me, it made me realize that I need to tap more into that. It made me tap more into that curiosity. I became very close friends with people that I'm still thankfully in connection with. And it made me realize how much my relationship with Chicago, when I had lived in the city, grew because I was able to experience the different cultures, but also I was starting to emerge more unapologetically about my queerness, and being in a queer AAPI or Asian American Pacific Islander space through I2I also helped to radicalize my politics, and realize that there's ways of what really shouldn't be radical, but radicalizing care, radicalizing empathy, and how can we be agents for that? And I'm not the kind of person that likes to, to be out in the streets. I will tell you that sometimes I cringe at hearing the word activist being named for me, because I haven't put my body on the line like other folks. But at the same time, there are other ways, other nonlinear ways of contributing to movements. It could be holding space for activists. It could be, doing storytelling, bringing communities, creating community spaces, introducing folks to different resources. There's multiple ways of how one can really be supportive in movement work. So I think that is to say, I was very much becoming more and more intentional about where my politics was going. It no longer felt liberalism, like the neoliberal vibes. I started to shift more away because I started to disagree even with folks in that side. And then I realized that I needed to be in a place, even though it felt like a lonely existence at times, that these are core beliefs that I have about human rights. These are core beliefs about what it means for Medicare for all. How do we think of law enforcement? And there are ideas that, or philosophies that have continued to evolve. And they always say that when you get older, you become more conservative. I feel like it's been the opposite. I feel like I have gone in a more like what people would call as some radical. But to me, I don't see it as radical. I see that as just having empathy and really giving a damn about people, and not sacrificing other people for the sake of it.
Yeah, I love that story because it's so for a lot of millennials who really formulated their political identities in a big way during the Obama administration, and then the years after the shift when Bernie came in, the election of Trump. I totally feel you on having that opposite feeling of, I didn't become more conservative. I became significantly more progressive, abandoning that neoliberal mindset. And I really appreciate that change. One thing that you had also talked about, sort of in line with change, but this is a different change. This is more. I mean, I'm sure that it has informed your politics, but this is so life all encompassing. One of the things that we had touched on previously was the 1-year anniversary of your brother's passing. First off, my condolences. I'm really sorry for your loss and your families. Grief is a subject that touches all our lives in different, significantly different ways. Sometimes it can be this immediate effect. Sometimes it can be this thing that happens that we don't notice until years down the road. But one thing is for sure, grief can permanently change your relationships, your relationships with other people, your relationship with yourself. What is your grieving process like? How did losing your brother change your life?
When my brother was diagnosed like 6 months before his passing, I remembered how, I think the first words were when he told me that he was not doing well, and I was like, "You gotta outlive our mom," And then I said, "And are you saying that I may not be that you may not be able to outlive me because he's only like 3 years young, like close to 3 years younger, and he's also a twin. And so, um, and I think that each month, weeks, then became weeks, and then days, like his health started uh, to deteriorate very quickly, and I felt like at the time I was also going through IOP, which is the intensive outpatient therapy. So that was also, in a way, good timing because I really needed to process what was happening with my brother. And when I found out about his death, and it it didn't prepare for me to understand the significance of the weight that it would hold because to this day, I don't think there's a day that I don't think about him. I think there are many moments where I start tearing up. I can go to a random place and then, something just hits me and I kind of lose it. So I think what I could say, what it has done for me, it shifted about what I felt was important in my life. The last conversation I had with my brother was only a few days before that, and forgive me if I get emotional, but I will say, um, when he, when I had told him about what was happening with work, that things were changing with the leadership, and I was becoming very stressed out. Like I had just came back from my vacation, dealing with this long jet lag, and um, and I was getting very unnerved by that because I was like, oh great, now I got this big gala. I gotta worry about all of these things that are happening. And my brother said, I think you really need to start looking elsewhere. And I told him, but I think it's too soon for me to do that. And I was arguing with him about that, but he insisted that I do that. And then fast forward, since it's passing, then we get into spring, I remembered I was so frustrated one day at work. I mean, I felt like I was working through grief, having to push through it without a choice. It didn't feel like I had much of a choice in during that time, and I was becoming more resentful by the day. And I was working on my laptop during lunch, and next thing you know, I just started crying. And one of my coworkers just came by and asked me if I was doing all right, and I was like, I said to him, where this is where like I wish I could tell him that he was right all along. And so yeah, I think when I look back on that period, I was like, yeah, he was really right all along. And I knew that I needed to change gears because I was heading into the summer and I thought about what happened the year before, what happened to me. And I'm like, I can't go through another period where where my own mental well-being is going to be completely undone. And here I am like pushing through and trying to just function. And I didn't feel like I was able to properly grieve because, it was like I was too busy to focus. And I think what I learned was that I knew how to finally step away, being able to walk away from things that do not work for me. That was work. I had never had like left a job like under my own free will. I was very worried, but I was feeling okay, I'm in a good position to finally do this. I had talked to my other brother about that and he was encouraging. And then I realized how much I value my solitary time, but I also how much I value deeper relationships with certain people in my life, right? And so I wanted to think about the quality of my relationships of people, the reciprocity. I think that was something that I looked for because there were people that reached out and were incredibly loving and were very consistent. And that really told me something about the kind of people that I need in my life and how I want to be as a person when they're going to um, through grief and through trauma. Um, so I would say that grief has definitely made me more intentional about where my alignment is. I think had I not gone through this whole grief process, I probably would not have, restarted my podcast. I don't think I would have had the creativity. I think being able to step away finally gave me this clarity and this time to finally start healing. Um, But I would say that, yeah, there are many moments where it has been a struggle. Um, there are times when I need to be in my own isolation. Um, but I also know that I find myself still connected to community and in a digital way too. And I think that has also been very helpful. I think people always say, you got to get off your phone or screen or your laptop screen, which is very true. But I also think that you have to have like people that you could still connect to and still talk to. And I felt like that was very helpful. And also if I feel like the world is too much, then I have to like go outside for like a few hours, touch grass, as the kids will say, you know, and and those were things that I needed to do. So I was more intentional about trying to take care of myself, but also, yeah, I think that the grief, after 1 year, it's still very visible. I mean, I can't go through an airport without thinking about my brother because he was such a nerd with airports and he knew his airports because he traveled a lot to work, and I remembered when I was coming back from Colombia, I was at the Cartagena airport. It was packed. And I looked at my Facebook and I realized that was the last time I talked to my brother, and I just started sobbing, and I was ugly crying, like, here I am, like, I can't talk to him about the airport of all things. I can't tell him about my trip. And then I realized that it is like 1 year already since I had talked to him. So it's still something that comes back, and I still have to deal with the twins' birthday, like in like less than a month. So I mean, there's gonna be like moments where it will come up, and yeah, I think it's still an ongoing process that I'm still going to be working through.
Wow.
Mm.
I mean, first, thank you for sharing that story. I know how difficult it is to even talk about. Sometimes just words, a song will trigger
Mhm. Oh
a
yeah,
flood of, and then once the dam's open, it's like like you have to ride it. Like you
yeah,
can stop it, but it just makes it even more
yeah.
intense.
There was one story that I remembered. I was taking my Vietnamese lessons online with my tutor. I was at a coffee shop, and the song by Simon and Garfunkel, "The Only Living Boy in New York," came on. That was the song that me and my brothers grew up because my dad was a big Simon and Garfunkel fan. The Bridge Over Troubled Water album was like his favorite, and he would play that like ad nauseum. And so when that song played, I was about to lose it because we also played that song for my brother's funeral. And here's my tutor trying to tell me, he's like, okay, say this after me and blah blah blah. And I was like trying so hard to fight back. I was like, oh my god, because I'm hearing the song playing in the background, and I'm trying really hard to keep it together because I didn't want to just embarrass myself, or at least like scare off my tutor, but I also didn't want to scare off anyone in the coffee shop too. So, that was one moment where, yeah, it really comes at a moment where you're like least expecting it, but also like the least convenient.
Yeah, yeah. It's it's one of those things when it happens, but I'm I always feel better, at least after at least in the having that moment of just unfiltered emotions.
Mhm.
And to that, I think it's I think it's so important for us to have this conversation because I think for the larger community of men with podcasting microphones,
Mhm. Mhm.
that is a conversation that you will rarely hear.
Mhm.
And for as much as alpha males want to talk about what's masculinity, what's manhood, what's strength, being able to share your story, that takes real strength.
Mhm.
And on that note, I want to shift to podcasting and a
Mhm.
focus on what we sort of mentioned earlier, which is the manosphere. I've talked at length on LAG about the manosphere, Andrew Tate, Passport Bros,
Mhm.
but sadly, the manosphere podcasters, they're still thriving. They're seemingly more than ever before. A lot of young ones,
Mhm.
podcasts of men just dunking on OnlyFans models, podcasts of men glazing Trump and crypto and hustle culture. But we're also in an interesting cultural moment where a lot of people are tired of it.
Mhm.
And a lot of folks are saying that we need less men with podcasts
Mhm.
because of all the horrible crap that they are saying. And the backlash has been so immense. Whether we want to talk about was it 2B movement or 4B movement,
Mhm.
the movement of women decentering men.
Mhm.
And so, as one of the few male podcasters that's doing things right, how do you feel about your role as host of the Banh Mi Chronicles? And how do you feel about the manosphere podcasting ecosystem in general?
Mhm. Mm. I think when I decided to step back, I did have reservations. I was like, okay, like, is this something that I should be proud of to be a podcaster? Because it felt so the world of podcasting felt so diluted, and in its association with extreme right wing conspiracy theorists and hate groups and what have you. And I hated having to. I dreaded having to like come up to people or like asking, well, what do you do? And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm a podcaster, and I have to like explain myself. And I had to get to a point where I'm like, okay, well, when I had my podcast through my Substack. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna add this to the Bun Me Bites. I'm gonna see how I'm gonna navigate this conversation, this spear. Who's actually in the spear right now that I could talk to, that I feel like that we need to align more closely with, and I think as a cis guy, even though I'm a queer guy, as a cis guy, I do see a responsibility that we have to be more cognizant of being able to have a platform that does not rage bait, that does not get into this unnecessary, you know, anger, trauma dumping. But what can we do to draw attention to the people actually doing the work, or paying close attention to what is happening, what other people, and this is something I had said earlier, is like, what are people really doing in our communities to uplift one another? And that was more of the framework that I have to go with, because if I go in with the mindset of this angry progressive, it's not going to be much better than, I guess, a right wing, you know, angry Joe Rogan and Andrew Tate. Like, this, it doesn't move the needle. So I think more intentionally about how can we be more responsible and vulnerable, and in a healthier way, where it's not just based on anger, but more of like trying to be more self-reflective, building our own self-awareness through, the platform. So I felt it was very important to at least try to model that. And I think of the many amazing Black, queer, women activists and content creators who continue to do great work. I mean, I think of Michelle Kim. I think of Sonia Renee Taylor. I think of Change Cadet. I think of Crutches and Spice. Those folks continue to use their platform with radical love and care for community, and there needs to be a normalization of that. And how do we try to get that to the community folks? And one of the things I have learned was I would do talks at universities, in Asian American resource centers, whether it's usually throughout Illinois. And I would always ask students, who is your favorite podcast, or what is your favorite podcast or podcaster? And I would always get that one male student that's going to say Joe Rogan. And, before that, I would always say, I'm not going to judge you, whatever. And of course, what do? I'd make a face. I'd make a stink face. I'm like, interesting. Again, and like, okay, but it tells me that a lot of young men, even of color, still navigate towards male podcasters, because for a lot of young men, they're trying to discover who they are. Where's their space? Because I think when they start seeing the Me Too movement, and when they start seeing women being more at the top, they're like, well, where's my place? You know, I still deserve it. Am I being canceled for no reason other than being a male? So you see a lot of right-wing male podcasters basically use trauma and confusion as a weapon, um, and try to empower them by making them feel superior by belittling women and trans folks and queer folks, and trying to define what masculinity is. Um, I do think that for us, there is a responsibility to try to again intercept that narrative, to offer that, and to see other men, but also supporting women, queer folks, trans folks as well, and supporting their platforms. And so I think that is an important discussion that's still ongoing, and we still need to have more content, especially with digital surveillance becoming more prominent. I mean, today TikTok is already owned by Larry, which is funny. That was my late brother. My late brother used to work for Oracle, and he used to tell me how much he hated Larry. And I did not know who he was, because I'm like, I don't, like, no one really knows the rest of billionaires. But then when he came into prominence this past year, I was like, man, if my brother was alive to hear this, he would have been rolling right about now. He hated him. So, but yeah, that goes to show you that as more censorship is happening, we still have to find ways to reach to younger folks, whether it's digitally or in person, because yeah, this is what led us to losing 2024 election and where we are at now in this defining moment.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot stress how much I agree with the importance of being in this space. I mean, even though it can be pretty daunting to look at podcasters who have millions of dollars and production teams and editors and people who can just churn out content, and here we are with either a team of one or a team of a few, trying to do the best that we can. And I'm grateful for everybody who's in this space. And you had mentioned something that I actually want to specifically focus on, which is you had mentioned going to these different speaking with these Asian organizations, because I want to talk about the Asian side of the manosphere, or the red pill sphere, because it's not just white and black and Latino passport bros and red pill and Joe Rogan fans. There's been a rise in conservatism among Asians significantly over the last 10 years, really. There are Asians and Chinese and Cambodians and Filipinos for Trump. There's the Ian Miles Chongs, the Roof Koreans, the Rob Schneiders and the Dean Cains of the world. There are the Asians who are against DEI and the ones who voted against affirmative action. So why do you think so many Asian men in particular started falling for the conservative grift? Like, why do you think some Asian men fall into communities that are actively hostile to Asian men?
I think what we have seen traditionally with Asian men is that, like, back in the respective homelands in the Asia continent, it was always very patriarchal, strictly patriarchal. And so there is this level of status, how the male gender is very superior. This is a very defined role. So I think that carries generationally speaking, and that transfers when you come to America or when you come to Canada or any Western country. So I think that the behavior has always been instilled. It's just planted in a different continent this time around, even with the diaspora. I think what I've learned, and this is something I had to think about, yesterday, was growing up, there was this pressure, especially as an oldest child, to be masculine, to be a man. to not cry, and I was the opposite of it. I mean, I was a crybaby, and when I was like 11, 12 years old, I discovered Madonna, Janet, and Mariah Carey, and I just became so infatuated with them. And my brothers would kind of pick on me about that, saying, "Oh, that's like you're into girly music," and people made fun of me because I like those three divas, and it kind of told me something about this pressure, this enormous pressure, not just within my own family, but also in the society that I grew up in. I mean, I grew up in the AIDS era of the early '90s, and so homophobia was very rampant. Going in high school, like you're going in the locker room, you would hear, "Well, don't look at me," in this insinuation that you're gay if you do this or do that and behave this way. So I think that there's this unrealistic expectation of what masculinity looks like, and I think for Asian men, especially when it comes from their own family and on top of society, I think that just only adds to this pressure that you have to be a breadwinner, that you have to be viable to marry a beautiful woman, and when Asian men that are looked upon by non-Asian men as not masculine enough, or being classified as being more feminine, that hurts a lot of Asian men. And I think that there is this needed pressure to overextend themselves to really prove that they are masculine, that they deserve to belong in the table with these men. And I think that can be a very detrimental. And I think a lot of those folks do get so into the rabbit hole of trying to prove their masculinity to their white masculine peers, who continue to shame them. So I think that for them, it's like a mountain that they need to climb over to be accepted into that space.
I'm glad that you had mentioned the idea of climbing that mountain, because I want to ask if you could advise these, I mean, not even just men, because there really is just a growing Asian conservative community.
Mhm.
But if you can advise different Asian people who have fallen for this red pill rabbit hole, how would you recommend they escape?
I would say, because I'm glad that I never had to escape from that, thank God. But I think what I've learned is vulnerability is a good escape. I think finding someone that you could be vulnerable with to share, I think can be very powerful, because I think what I like to say to conservative or right-wing Asian men in this case would be, what do you want the outcome to look like for you? What do you want the outcome, like what makes you so angry? What makes you so depressed? What makes you feel this certain way? Like, am I don't know if this is going to work, but I hope that people that those men are allowed to be vulnerable for a moment, and being able to maybe have an opportunity to self-reflect and build a little bit of self-awareness, and be in other spaces with women, with other men who are also unlearning. But I think to not necessarily skip, but I hope that maybe the shift will be to, you know, go outside of your norm. Don't be afraid to explore things that you've always wanted to explore. Um, I think I think um for anyone that goes into the red pill area, it's like, well, what are the things that you are scared of the most? What are you most threatened by? Why does this threaten you? I think those are questions that we have to ask more intently, because I do see that people, like when you call them names, and yeah, and I am guilty of it. I'm very unapologetic about how I feel about people that come from me or from my friends. But I also feel like, okay, is there an opportunity for you to like really deal with your shit, and hopefully be a better community member? So I think that is to say, maybe for other men, I hope that we model ways that are healthy and that we continue to unlearn things that we were taught from a young age and the societal expectations of what being a man is. So I think that if we continue to model it and if we continue to have open conversations, then I hope that we may be able to pull some people away from the red pill or detox from it.
You had touched on, really assessing these threats, because I want to zoom out and talk about something that is a growing and very real threat. And I want to talk about Asian immigration and ICE. For many years, Asian Trump voters have drawn these lines between them and Latinos, trying to describe themselves as, we're the good ones. There were huge communities of different Asian groups, Filipinos, Vietnamese, Chinese, Cambodians, for Trump. And many of them, again, showed up in 2024 to vote for him a second time. But over the last year of Trump's second term, a lot has changed. This month, the Trump administration froze the visa processing for 75 different countries, including Cambodia. Dozens of Asian immigrants have been detained by ICE. They have seemingly died in detention centers. And community members are describing what's happening as just straight up disappearances, people going out to get groceries and they never come back. As a Vietnamese Cambodian, as somebody who is in Chicago, how do you feel seeing all these people in your community being targeted?
It's very disheartening. I think that it's something that has been something that I have feared for a long time. I mean, ever since I knew about ICE in 2012. I mean, ICE had started like a decade before that, but as I started to learn more about ICE, way back, before a lot of other people caught on, I was like, this is like slave patrol shit that we're talking about here. This is like very dehumanizing, and this has not been unique. Unfortunately, with the Trump administration, specifically with Stephen Miller, it has only doubled down in broad daylight. Like back then, it used to be more like we have to do it more discreetly and a little bit more judiciously and whatnot. But this time, it's more like everyone's fair game. So it is very disheartening to see our community members being targeted. And the Southeast Asian community for years, specifically with the Cambodian, Laos, and certain Vietnamese folks, they were facing deportation raids in the past. And this has been, unfortunately, a common narrative in our community that our community struggles to openly talk about. But luckily, there's like great organizations like, CFIN, CRAC, and Cagewell, which is like a grassroots Cambodian-run group that fights against deportations and advocates. So I think that, yeah, it's incredibly disheartening. Very disheartening that there are still people in the community that are still shrugging it off and pretending that none of this really matters, that this does not apply to them. There's this attitude like within our community that among those folks of that I got mine and I don't have to, and just shut the door behind everyone else, even their own community members. I think that there is a level of trying to be like, it's not my problem. It has nothing to do with me. And listening to the narratives of like, they should have complied, we did it the right way. And, these tired narratives that you would hear constantly. And I think what the Republicans have done a really good job of is, again, like weaponizing trauma. They know how to work with immigrant fears and trauma because immigrant and refugees come in with like this this unchecked trauma that they carry through for the rest of their lives. And what the Republicans are good at doing, naming that and creating a monster out of that, making sure that they are continuing to be fearful of other immigrants and other governments, like in the Vietnamese community. The idea of socialism is like a four-letter word, because of the Vietnam War and what the North did with its takeover in the South. And so they see images of that. You see with the Cuban population and why the word socialism is such a four-letter word. So I think that yes, there's definitely the history that that guides them to make these very consequential positions. But yeah, I think it's very telling. I think it's something that is very frustrating. I also feel like another thing is that our younger generations don't have the best communications abilities to talk to their parents because of the language barriers. Like for example, like I am not a proper Vietnamese speaker, nor could I speak Cambodian, but yet like it's hard for me to have the high level conversation that I need to have with my parents because of the language barrier, but also the educational barrier too. And also the reality that they work with versus what we see. A lot of our immigrant refugee parents work day and night. They work and don't have time to observe anything else. And for people like us, we can read the news, we can, be in community spaces, we can do our little hobbies, do our little travels, and we're more equipped to understand the world. But I think that you have that, and also even the language translation. I think someone told me last night, saying that Trump, it's hard for the Vietnamese speaking people to actually hear the full translation of what Trump is saying because it's translated into a more proper Vietnamese. So therefore, it seems like he's coming off a lot smarter than he really is. So I think that's also another perspective I've been hearing. So yeah, I think that is all to say that that there's a lot of communicational barriers between our generations, and also the traumas that they have faced, and how unchecked trauma unfortunately guides them into where they are at.
My last question, as a Southeast Asian, as a brown Asian, you know, we're in this space where we look foreign, but we're also racially ambiguous.
Mhm.
How do you feel, just especially nowadays, just walking around? Do you carry your papers around? Have you encountered ICE?
I did for a time when the ICE raids were really making its presence known in Chicago. I never thought I would have to do that. I had avoided going to the city directly, even though they were going into the suburbs. Let's also not mistaken that. But
Mhm.
I kept away from the city for a good month, unfortunately. And I think that yes, I was genuinely terrified. I was also very genuinely terrified for both of my parents because they're elder and they're also disabled. And I worried about, my brother and my sister-in-law because they lived in Lakeview, which is a very predominantly upper class neighborhood by Wrigley Field. But ICE, luckily they were gone, but ICE was throwing tear gas in that neighborhood of all places.
Wow.
And my brother was actually, they were getting married. They were doing their photo shoot in California when that happened. So they luckily dodged a bullet. But yeah, it's a very disorienting time. And yeah, and there's a part of me that feels emboldened to say what I need to say. I think maybe grief has kind of taught me to not like hold back a lot, even though it may be a little reckless. But yeah, I feel uneasy when I have to travel. When I come back from an airport, am I going to be detained? I think these are realities, and the more I start hearing about friends, that know other people, and eventually them, yeah, it's very real, and it's something that I hope that we continue to shed more light on, and that we give more power to what we do with our fears and how we turn that into action and protection of community members.
I mean, I couldn't end it on a better note. Randy, honestly, it's been an honor chatting with you
Mhm.
today. I think we've all learned so much and appreciate you stopping by Seasoned Fighters. You are always, always welcome back on the show. I think as a lot of these things change and as year two, only year two in this administration
Mhm.
rolls on, we're going to need more guidance. And, I appreciate your voice. But before we head out, can you please tell the folks watching at home, what are you working on these days and where can we find and support you?
Yeah, I am continuing to hopefully do new episodes of the podcast. I'm also thinking about adding maybe a coffee break segment where it's gonna be more fun things, more non-consequential things, because I recognize that yes, a lot of the content, especially what I was doing in fall, is very heavy hitting and can be feel very deflating at times. So I also kind of want to at least have moments where I can gossip about funny shits, or whether it's about the Beckham's drama, which is quite perplexing to me. Still, it's rich white people's problem, but it's the kind of thing that you laugh at, or talking about sports or talking about entertainment. So I like to have hopefully an exit, a temporary exit, and as an exit ramp, because I do think that we kind of need to have a little bit of joy in this very intoxicating, infuriating world that we live in. So yes, I think that's what I hope to be doing more of. Yeah, I'm gonna keep it relatively open, but I would like to, one day hope to do a one-man show. I would love to do one. That would be great if I could pull that off. But yeah, hopefully maybe being in more community spaces and it's kind of manifesting it from there. Yeah, you can find me on the Banh Mì Chronicles, BANHMI_Chronicles on Instagram. You can, follow the podcast through my Substack or through YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and I'm not going to name that other evil empire. Yeah, you can follow that. You can follow my podcast on those platforms, and I'm also on TikTok, so I'm on Banh Mì Chronicles straight up. And yeah, I also, like to do more content creation. I like to do more TikTok and Instagram reels and videos and entertain and share hot takes sometimes. So yeah, it's not always restricted to the podcast.
Awesome. All right, everybody. That is the final bell. Thanks for being in our corner. And don't forget to follow Randy Kim and the Banh Mì Chronicles all over social media and wherever you listen to podcasts. And we'll see you for another round. Peace.
Thank you.